At first glance, headlines such as "At 70, the tragedy of Mr. Bean star Rowan Atkinson is beyond heartbreaking" suggest a narrative of decline, loss, or personal downfall. However, when examined through the lens of professional achievement and career longevity, this framing is deeply misleading. Rowan Atkinson's career at the age of 70 is not tragic. On the contrary, it represents one of the most successful and strategically managed trajectories in modern entertainment. Rowan Atkinson is not merely the actor behind Mr. Bean. He is a classically trained performer with an academic background that sets Hyam apart from many of his peers. Holding a master's degree in electrical engineering from Oxford University, Atkinson entered comedy with a strong intellectual foundation, which became evident in his early work. His breakthrough in Not the 9 O'Clock News demonstrated sharp political satire and verbal wit, while Blackadder later cemented his reputation as a sophisticated comic actor capable of linguistic precision, irony, and historical parody. Mr. Bean, the character most closely associated with Atkinson, represents a unique artistic achievement rather than a creatively imitation. The near-silent format of the character required exceptional control of physical comedy, timing, and facial expression. Few performers in modern television history have managed to create a character with such universal reach. Mr. Bean transcended language, culture, and age, becoming a global phenomenon long before the era of social media virality. This alone places Atkinson in a rare category of performers whose work has genuine cross-generational and cross-cultural permanence. Importantly, Atkinson did not allow himself to be consumed indefinitely by this role. Unlike many actors who attempt to endlessly replicate a successful formula, he made a deliberate decision to limit Mr. Bean's appearances. This restraint preserved the character's cultural value and prevented creative exhaustion. His later work in the Johnny English franchise illustrates another strategic choice: embracing parody in a controlled, self-aware manner, while maintaining strong commercial appeal. The films may not always have been critical favorites, but they demonstrated Atkinson's continued relevance in a changing entertainment market. Claims of tragedy often arise from Atkinson's reduced on-screen presence in recent years. Yet, this reduction is best understood as intentional selectivity rather than professional decline. Having achieved financial security, artistic recognition, and cultural legacy, Atkinson no longer needs constant visibility to validate his career. Many artists of his stature choose to step back, focusing on personal interests, voice work, or occasional projects that align with their values rather than market pressure. In professional terms, tragedy implies unfulfilled potential or premature collapse. Rowan Atkinson's career reflects neither. It reflects completion, control, and longevity. At 70, he stands not as a fallen star, but as an artist who has already shaped global comedy and now exercises the rare privilege of choosing when and whether to return. If Rowan Atkinson's professional life resists the label of tragedy, the same can be said, though with more nuance, of his personal life. Media narratives that describe his situation at 70 as beyond heartbreaking rely heavily on selective storytelling, emotional exaggeration, and the public's tendency to conflate private change with personal failure. When examined objectively, these claims reveal more about modern celebrity journalism than about Atkinson himself. Much of the so-called tragedy centers on Atkinson's divorce after more than 2 decades of marriage. Divorce, particularly later in life, is frequently framed by tabloids as evidence of collapse or regret. In reality, Long-term relationships can end for many reasons, including personal growth, evolving priorities, and mutual recognition that a partnership has run its course. There is no credible indication that Atkinson's separation resulted in public breakdown, professional instability, or lasting emotional damage. Treating the end of a marriage as inherently tragic oversimplifies human relationships and ignores the resilience of individuals involved. Another focal point for sensational coverage is Atkinson's relationship with a younger partner. Age gap relationships often provoke moral judgment, especially when they involve public figures. Media outlets exploit this discomfort by presenting such relationships as proof of crisis or desperation. However, Atkinson has consistently maintained privacy and discretion regarding his personal affairs. There is no public record of scandal, exploitation, or erratic behavior that would justify portraying his personal choices as catastrophic. The discomfort lies not in the reality of his life, but in society's expectations of how a man in his 70s should behave. A subtler but more meaningful challenge Atkinson has faced is the psychological weight of lifelong public identification with a single character. Being permanently associated with Mr. Being a largely silent, childlike figure can distort public perception of Atkinson as an individual. This phenomenon, common among iconic performers, creates a disconnect between the complexity of the person and the simplicity of the character. The tragedy, if one must be named, lies not in Atkinson's life choices, but in the public's difficulty separating the man from the mask he wore so convincingly. Media narratives thrive on decline because decline creates drama. Aging, in particular, is treated as a storyline of loss rather than transition. When an artist reduces output, avoids publicity, or prioritizes personal life, it is framed as fading relevance. This perspective ignores an alternative interpretation, that Atkinson has reached a stage of autonomy rarely afforded to public figures. He no longer needs to perform constantly to justify his existence in the public eye. Ultimately, the idea that Rowan Atkinson's life at 70 is beyond heartbreaking collapses under scrutiny. What emerges instead is a portrait of a man who has accepted change, exercised personal agency, and stepped away from external validation. The real myth is not his tragedy, but the assumption that a quieter life must be a sad one. If Rowan Atkinson's life at 70 contains any element that could reasonably be described as tragic, it does not lie in scandal, decline, or personal misfortune. Rather, it lies in a far more subtle and ironic phenomenon: the price of overwhelming success. Atkinson's greatest triumph, Mr. Bean, also became the defining lens through which much of the public continues to view him, often at the expense of his broader artistic identity. Mr. Bean is one of the most recognizable fictional characters of the late 20th century. The character's simplicity, silence, and exaggerated physicality allowed Hayam to cross linguistic and cultural boundaries with unprecedented ease. For global audiences, Mr. Bean is comedy in its purest form. However, this same universality has flattened public understanding of the actor behind the role. Atkinson, a performer with exceptional verbal intelligence and classical comedic training, became globally known for a character who barely speaks. The contradiction is striking. This form of typecasting differs from the conventional Hollywood version. Atkinson was not repeatedly cast in similar roles by studios. Instead, he was cast repeatedly in the public imagination. No matter how sharp his dialogue in Blackadder, how articulate his interviews, or how nuanced his theatrical performances, they remained secondary to the eye image of a man in a tweed jacket pulling exaggerated facial expressions. This is the quiet burden of cultural immortality. The character survives so completely that it obscures the creator. Atkinson himself has acknowledged this tension. He has spoken openly about the creative limitations of continuing Mr. Bean indefinitely and the physical demands of maintaining such a character as he ages. Ending or reducing the character was not a failure, but a necessity, an act of artistic preservation rather than retreat. Yet for audiences accustomed to constant repetition, absence is often misread as loss. There is also a deeper psychological dimension to this kind of success. When a single creation becomes globally dominant, it freezes an artist in time. The public expects familiarity, not evolution. Any attempt to move beyond the iconic role risks disappointment or rejection. In this context, Atkinson's selective withdrawal from mainstream visibility can be understood as self-protection. Choosing not to compete with one's own legend may be the only rational response. The tragedy, then, is not that Rowan Atkinson has aged, stepped back, or changed. It is that modern media struggles to recognize fulfillment when it is not accompanied by constant productivity or spectacle. A life that has already delivered lasting cultural value is wrongly measured against the standards of perpetual novelty. At 70, Rowan Atkinson does not represent heartbreak. He represents completion. His work continues to circulate, educate, and entertain without his active participation. Few artists achieve this level of permanence. If tragedy exists, it lies in the misconception that a quieter presence signifies a diminished life, when in reality it may signify the rare achievement of artistic closure and personal autonomy. The final layer of the so-called tragedy surrounding Rowan Atkinson at 70 reveals less about the man himself and more about society's unease with aging, particularly when aging involves a withdrawal from constant public performance. Modern celebrity culture is built on visibility, productivity, and perpetual relevance. When an individual who once dominated the cultural landscape chooses restraint instead of reinvention, the media often interprets that choice as loss rather than dignity. Rowan Atkinson's case highlights a fundamental misunderstanding of aging in creative professions. In many industries, longevity is associated with mentorship, authority, and earned discretion. In entertainment, however, aging is frequently framed as decline unless accompanied by reinvention that maintains public attention. Atkinson has largely rejected this expectation. He has not attempted to modernize Mr. Bean for social media, nor has he pursued aggressive rebranding to remain in the spotlight. This refusal is often mischaracterized as irrelevance, when it may instead reflect self-awareness and restraint. There is also a cultural discomfort with the idea that a performer's primary contribution may already be complete. Audiences are accustomed to endless sequels, reboots, and recycled personas. When an artist resists this cycle, it disrupts the consumer narrative. Atkinson's limited engagement in later years challenges the assumption that value must be continually proven. His legacy exists independently of new output. Yet, media frameworks struggle to accommodate this model of success. Another factor fueling the heartbreaking narrative is the projection of public emotion onto private aging. Wrinkles, slower movements, or reduced screen time become symbols onto which audiences project their own fears of mortality and obsolescence. Atkinson, known for extreme physical comedy, becomes an especially potent symbol. The public unconsciously mourns not his life, but the youthful elasticity of the character they loved. This emotional displacement is then misinterpreted as concern for the actor's well-being. Crucially, Atkinson has shown no signs of bitterness or desperation. He has continued to express thoughtful opinions on comedy, free expression, and public discourse. His selective appearances are measured, articulate, and grounded. These are not the behaviors of a man in decline, but of one who has recalibrated his relationship with fame. The media's fixation on labeling Atkinson's later years as tragic ultimately reflects an inability to respect a non-performative life. There is little narrative appeal in contentment, autonomy, or quiet fulfillment. So these states are reframed as melancholy. Yet dignity in aging often looks precisely like what Atkinson has chosen: fewer obligations, greater privacy, and freedom from the demand to entertain. In this light, the true issue is not Rowan Atkinson's life at 70, but a cultural environment that equates worth with visibility. His story offers an alternative model, one in which success culminates not in endless performance, but in the freedom to step away. Calling this outcome tragic says more about collective insecurity than about the man high himself. The final misconception embedded in narratives about Rowan Atkinson at 70 is the belief that legacy must remain active in order to remain meaningful. This assumption lies at the heart of claims that his later years are heartbreaking. In reality, Atkinson's life at this stage represents a rare and often misunderstood achievement, a legacy that no longer requires maintenance. In the entertainment industry, most careers are fragile. Relevance is temporary. Audiences are fickle, and cultural memory is short. Against this backdrop, Atkinson's position is extraordinary. Characters such as Mr. Bean and Edmund Blackadder continue to circulate globally through reruns, digital platforms, and cultural references without his direct involvement. Children discover Mr. Bean decades after its original broadcast, while older audiences revisit the work with renewed appreciation. This endurance is not accidental. It is the result of carefully crafted comedy that relies on structure, timing, and human universals rather than trends. Atkinson's decision to avoid overexposure has protected this legacy. By resisting endless sequels or forced revivals, he has allowed his most iconic work to retain its integrity. Many performers dilute their impact by remaining visible at all costs. Atkinson has done the opposite, demonstrating that absence can function as a form of artistic discipline. In this sense, his later years are not a period of retreat, but of stewardship preserving meaning, by knowing when to stop. Another overlooked aspect of his legacy is intellectual credibility. Unlike many comedic figures whose public personas consume their private identities, Atkinson has consistently demonstrated intellectual seriousness. His public discussions on free speech, satire, and the role of comedy in democratic societies reveal a thinker who understands comedy as a social instrument, not merely entertainment. This dimension of his legacy is rarely highlighted in sensational headlines, yet it may prove more influential over time than any single character. At 70, Atkinson also embodies an alternative model of success for future performers. His career suggests that fulfillment does not require constant reinvention or public validation. It allows for cycles of intensity and withdrawal, creation and rest. In an era where artists are pressured to remain permanently accessible, this model is quietly radical. Ultimately, Rowan Atkinson's life at 70 represents resolution rather than regret. The heartbreak exists only if one assumes that value diminishes when visibility fades. His story challenges that assumption. It invites a broader understanding of success, one measured not by continued output, but by lasting impact and personal autonomy. If legacy is the ability to step away while one's work continues to speak, then Rowan Atkinson has achieved what few ever do. Far from tragic. His position is enviable. A completed body of work, global recognition, and the freedom to live beyond the demands of performance. In bringing together the themes explored throughout this discussion, it becomes clear that the portrayal of Rowan Atkinson's life at 70 as beyond heartbreaking is not only inaccurate, but fundamentally misplaced. What has often been framed as tragedy is, in fact, a convergence of longevity, autonomy, and completion qualities rarely acknowledged or celebrated in modern celebrity culture. The persistence of tragic narratives reflects a broader media habit of imposing dramatic arcs onto lives that no longer conform to conventional storytelling structures. Audiences are conditioned to expect rise, peak, and fall. When a figure like Atkinson reaches the peak and chooses not to enact a visible fall, the media fills the void with speculation. Aging becomes decline, privacy becomes isolation, and selectivity becomes irrelevance. These interpretations say little about Atkinson's reality and much about the limitations of the narrative frameworks applied to public figures. Atkinson's career, when viewed holistically, demonstrates intentionality at every stage. He built his reputation through intellectual comedy, expanded it through global physical humor, and protected it through restraint. Each phase reflects choice rather than accident. The absence of constant public output in later years is consistent with this pattern, not a deviation from it. It suggests a man who understands the life cycle of creative work and respects its natural conclusion. Equally important is the distinction between public demand and personal fulfillment. Atkinson owes nothing further to the audience that continues to enjoy his past work. Cultural contribution is not a debt that must be endlessly repaid. Yet the idea that an artist may simply stop without apology or explanation remains uncomfortable for a society that equates worth with productivity. Labeling this choice as tragic becomes a way of avoiding that discomfort. The emotional response many feel toward Atkinson's aging is better understood as collective nostalgia. Viewers mourn a version of themselves associated with the era in which Mr. Bean or Blackadder first aired. This nostalgia is then projected onto the performer, transforming personal memory into imagined suffering. In this sense, the heartbreak belongs not to Atkinson, but to an audience grappling with its own passage of time. Reframing Atkinson's later years requires abandoning sensationalism in favor of realism. At 70, he is not a cautionary tale, but a counterexample. He demonstrates that a public life does not need to end in collapse to be complete, and that success does not demand perpetual visibility. His story offers a quieter, more dignified conclusion, one in which achievement is measured by endurance, influence, and the freedom to step away. Seen through this lens, Rowan Atkinson's life at 70 is not tragic. It is resolved. And in a culture obsessed with spectacle, that may be its most misunderstood quality. Beyond the individual case of Rowan Atkinson, the narrative constructed around his life at 70 exposes a deeper cultural issue. Modern society's difficulty in recognizing success once it is no longer loud, visible, or ongoing. Atkinson's story functions as a mirror, reflecting how achievement is measured not by substance or longevity, but by constant performance and renewal. In this sense, the mislabeling of his later years as tragic reveals more about collective values than about the man he himself. Contemporary culture is driven by acceleration. Careers are expected to scale rapidly, peak publicly, and remain continuously productive. Silence, pauses, or endings are interpreted as failure because they disrupt the rhythm of consumption. Rowan Atkinson violates this expectation. He has not rebranded himself to appeal to younger demographics, nor has he attempted to modernize his iconic characters to fit current digital formats. Instead, he has allowed his work to exist independently of his personal visibility. This choice challenges the assumption that relevance must be actively defended. There is also a discomfort with finality embedded in public reaction to Atkinson's withdrawal. Completion is rarely celebrated. It is feared. A finished body of work suggests limits, mortality, and closure concepts that conflict with a culture obsessed with growth and expansion. By stepping back, Atkinson implicitly asserts that it is possible to be done without being defeated. This idea runs counter to prevailing narratives, which often equate stopping with giving up. From a professional standpoint, Atkinson represents a model of sustainable success. He avoided overproduction, protected his intellectual property, and resisted dilution of his most valuable creative assets. Many performers exhaust their relevance by oversaturating the market with repetitions of past success. Atkinson's restraint preserved the distinctiveness of his work and allowed it to age without embarrassment. In strategic terms, this is not mismanagement. It is long-term brand stewardship. His story also raises questions about audience entitlement. There is an implicit belief that beloved performers owe perpetual access to their talents. When that access is reduced, disappointment is reframed as concern, and concern as tragedy. Yet, creative labor is not an infinite resource. Atkinson's withdrawal underscores a truth often ignored. Artists are not public utilities, and their value does not diminish when they choose rest or privacy. Ultimately, Rowan Atkinson's later life invites a redefinition of success itself. Success need not culminate in decline, scandal, or reinvention. It can culminate in autonomy. It can end quietly, with dignity intact and meaning preserved. In a media environment addicted to drama, this form of success is difficult to narrate, so it is mislabeled. Seen this way, Atkinson's story is not exceptional because it is sad, but because it is complete. It offers a rare example of what happens when achievement is allowed to conclude on its own terms. The tragedy, if one insists on using the word, lies not in his life, but in a culture that struggles to recognize fulfillment when it no longer performs for applause.